Okay, the Gilded Age. Mark Twain wrote about how we were in a Gilded Age. He created the term. When exactly is the Gilded Age?
Post-Civil War.
Yeah, post-Civil War. Just kind of think a couple of decades after the post-Civil War. The 1870s, 1880s, going into the 1890s. Okay, there's no set time limit. Name me the best president between Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt.
Grover Cleveland.
Grover Cleveland. He was so good that he lost, but then he won again. Barely winning.
William McKinley.
William McKinley. A lot of people will kind of go with William McKinley in there, which he's on the very end.
Andrew Johnson.
Andrew Johnson.
Chester Arfield.
Chester Arthur, because he's a great dresser. All right, we'll get back to the president's video sometime here, and you'll see with them and Chester Arthur. But for the most part, if we want to go for the weakest group of presidents, it's that group. Your next president's quiz that you have, when it is 16 through 25, is usually the ones that are the most forgotten. And realistically, it's because there's a whole bunch of them that a lot of times we maybe shouldn't even have a president. Garfield got shot for 2 months before he died. Congress wasn't even in session. He wasn't really running anything with the country, and we did fine for 2 months. No Congress, no president. And it might work that way also right now. But we had a lot of weak presidents, but we had a strong legislative branch. Remember the radical Republicans with Reconstruction? They kind of keep it going afterwards. The main thing, and here's the theme politically for this time, is against political machines. And you're going to see with this, I know we've had a couple things in our daily history with that. For the most part, you look at it and say, oh, look, there's all these Republicans. Republicans controlled, but we were really quite even. The Republicans controlled the presidency, but the Democrats actually were in control for most cities, urban areas, and then down in the South. So it's not totally all Republican control, even though it's mainly Republican presidents. And of those Republican presidents, none of them are really powerful. And the Democrats are not powerful either. So we get to a time politically, there really is. And the Supreme Court, it really isn't doing anything. The only cases you're really going to end up to need to know here will be Plessy versus Ferguson and Munn versus Illinois, which we've had already a little bit on it. Now, the two main parties are Republican and Democrats. From this point on, every part of history, until, of course, 2040 when us Whigs come back, but from this point on in history, it is Republicans and Democrats. There were 16 solid states that you knew were going to be Republican. All right, today we call them red states. I will tell you, though, when you see the map of it, it is not the same red states that we have today.
How many states were there at the time?
What'd you say?
How many states were there at the time?
Well, it's over that time we add a bunch of new states, and you're going to see two maps that by the time we get to this end of this time period, we are up to like 46 or basically 45 states in there. So we get almost that. The groups that were solid Republicans, African Americans. Are African Americans solid Republicans today? No. This is where we will have a transformation in politics. Okay? African Americans now, over 90% of them vote Democrat. And that was before Obama. This is where Franklin Roosevelt will be a person that switches the politics. But at that time period, the Republican Party was the party that was to end slavery. We have our Northern Lincoln Republicans. Pretty much our Northerners that don't live in the cities, although there are Republicans in the city, but that's where it was in the North. Middle class families were usually Republican. And then when I have old stock, anybody know what it means when you hear old stock?
Old people?
No, it's not old people, although a lot of times they are. It's the richer, older families. They're the ones that have been around for several generations. They're not the new immigrants. Now, their ancestors might have been immigrants back in the 18-teens, 20s. Even now, we're starting to get some of the old stock to be Irish. One of the things, I mentioned this in the Reconstruction side, but one way to keep these Republicans together is you wave the bloody shirt. Whenever Republicans start to go off and not vote as a group, You remind them that the Civil War happened. We had people die, and the Republicans, they were together with that. So it was a way to kind of keep Republicans together in that coalition. Meanwhile, the Democrats, 14 solid states, most of those states in the South. Is that true today? No. Today, the South is mainly Republican. Remember, Florida, we are not a southern state. Yes, geographically, we are southern. We are not a southern state in culture. Okay? We in Ohio are of kindred spirit. When you talk about the mix of how the population is there. But the Deep South was very Democrat. The other ones besides Southerners that were white, Catholics. Catholics at that time were very Democrat. Here's another thing that we've seen. Now we've had a change in politics in the last 30 years where Catholics that used to be strongly Democrat, more and more of them are becoming Republican. Anyone know what issue has made Democrats leave, or made Catholics leave the Democratic Party for the Republican Party in recent years? Well, birth control, abortion. Basically since Roe versus Wade. And this is where it's kind of a controversy with different groups within the Catholic Church. Because more of the things the Democrats go for are traditional for things for the idea of helping the disadvantaged side. But when you come to the social issues, and especially abortion, that's where the Catholic Church. So, and what we're kind of seeing in America today is our old Catholics and more of our traditional Anglo-Saxon Catholics are going with the Republicans. Our newer Catholics, which are more Hispanic, they are going with the Democrats there. And immigrants. And this is the one group, when we see all these groups that kind of switch parties, but from the very beginning of the Democrat, when they were Democratic Republicans, immigrants have almost always, or basically have always been pretty solid for the Democrats. They were the ones that supported Jefferson. Here we are in the late 1800s. And our immigrants, whether usually from Asia or from Latin America, they support mainly the Democratic Party today. So that's something that has held true through history, where everything else in politics have kind of flipped around.
Is the Republican Party always been like more conservative? Because like.
And actually, this is where it depends. Technically, no. Conservative means that you don't want change. You want the status quo. The Democrats, before the Civil War, were the conservative party because they wanted to keep it the same, keep it where slavery, and they didn't make any changes. The Republicans were wanting change. So that is where we've actually flip-flopped. Now, when you go for different issues, it might be a little bit different. But if you take what is truly the conservative liberal, conservative against change, liberal for change. And again, that's simplifying it, but that's where, so it isn't always. And the other thing is, what's conservative today may not have been conservative even 30, 40 years ago. This is where the Republican Party has a little bit of a hard time with some of the things that they argue for, because they have a coalition today of different groups together. The only thing that they were waving to try to stay together instead of a bloody shirt, they were waving Obamacare to keep them together. Okay, and so that's where, and some people go, oh, the Republicans are going to die. They're not going to die. Every time with a political party, whenever you have something that come down, they reform, and they can always go and and the way the American system's set up, yeah, they lost the presidency, they still have the House. They control 31 of the 50 governorships that you have. So Republicans, they're not a dead part. It's just there's certain areas and things that they have. All right, here's where you look at this, and this map, because sometimes that time period is hard to get it. You notice the Deep South is blue. If we were doing a map today, and actually you look on the side map over there, you see the Deep South is pretty red. The Midwest is really blue and Democrat, which the part that were the new states, they would turn to be Democrat. But today, that's the area that's Republican in the red. Meanwhile, New England was pretty Republican. That was a lot the heart of the Republican Party when it started before the Civil War. When we get to today, that's actually the heart of the Democrat Party today. So the one thing that's kind of held true, though, for the Democrats is the Democrats have always been more urban and city. Are people in urban areas and city more likely to want to have change there. So that's where you kind of see that part. All right, Southern politics, this is a review. It's controlled by the rich. Remember that phrase, bourbon rule? Hopefully you get used to that. I put it in 3 to say. What are Jim Crow laws? Okay, segregation laws. After the Reconstruction ends, we have the segregation laws. They're upheld by Plessy versus Ferguson. The phrase to remember with Plessy versus Ferguson is separate but equal. The South remembers the separate side. They always forget the equal side. And this is the Supreme Court saying that Jim Crow is legal. What are some ways that Southern whites were trying to keep blacks as well as poor whites from voting?
Taxes on
Poll taxes, grandfather laws, literacy test, intimidation. So you've got.
Were the black codes one of the things, or was that?
No, black codes were before this because the 14th Amendment would end the black codes. Now, and that's why, like I said, you need to make sure you don't confuse slavery and segregation. Those are 2 different things. The black codes and Jim Crow laws, although they are very similar, they are not. Black codes are specifically saying this race can't do it. Segregation says they are separated. They're not saying that you can't drink out of a water fountain. It's just you drink out of a separate water fountain. There, and I know that seems like, okay, that's just semantics. It really is more than that to kind of show the understanding of it. I think I put her name in here before, but this is where, for Ida B. Wells, it's one that you may not remember along the way, but this is where we were kind of she was leading the movement against lynching. What is lynching? Yeah, hanging without a trial, which was an easy way to intimidate. There. All right, Booker T. Washington, W.D. Du Bois. We had them both on the People reports before. Booker T. Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute. Mission is to teach skills in the economic self-help. His idea was for African Americans in the South, we're going to teach you something where you become economically viable. Have something that the society needs. You're not going to just be seen as a laborer. I think before I gave the example of like a mechanic today. When Susie breaks down and I take her to a mechanic, he or she can do stuff I can't do. I know I've had this before also, but the Atlanta Compromise, and this is one that you kind of got to remember with. Here's one of the things that kind of a test type of question you like throwing. Know him with Booker T. Washington. A speech that he gave in Atlanta. Today, if we were to look at it, you would say, oh my gosh, this guy was like so accepting of segregation. But he wasn't. And again, you have to put yourself in that time period of history, not in the eyes of 2012. You have to look at it as like 110 years ago. And what he was wanting is for the South, let's just make steps. Okay, we can't go and swoop and change everything overnight. And if this generation becomes more educated, the next generation will be better, and that's the way he kind of looked at it, as over a time period, then the Southern blacks would become equal.
When was the
1890 something. I don't remember the exact year. It's real close to Plessy versus Ferguson, so the 1890s. For some reason, I'm thinking 1898, but I'm not sure. But this is the time period. All right, Du Bois is from the North. For trivia-wise, he is our first African American to receive a doctorate. Not a medical doctor. Okay, you can get a doctorate in all kinds of different things. In here, but this is where he received a doctorate of philosophy. He is a leader of the educated blacks in the North. So his group of people that he's around are people that are college educated African Americans living in the North. Are they going to have a different viewpoint of the world than Booker T. Washington, who is around a lot of blacks that are sharecroppers and very poor, and many of them uneducated? So his viewpoint was, and what becomes known as the Niagara Movement was, we have to end everything right now. We want equality right now. None of this Atlanta Compromise, none of this waiting for it. And for the North and that viewpoint, it was something that that seemed right. But again, you have to take yourself to that time period. What he is saying would be more idealistic, while Booker T. Washington was more pragmatic with what his idea was. And this is where, who was the most famous teacher that we had for Booker T. Washington in the South at Tuskegee Institute? Who's the peanut guy?
Carter.
Yeah, Carver, not Carter. Carver. And so Carver inventing these things that are from things built in the South. And that's where he would kind of go with from Booker T. Washington. This is kind of going to our next thing, but today the leading organization for African Americans is the NAACP, which Du Bois would be one of the founders of it. The ideas of the NAACP comes from the Niagara movement. Now for your SFIs and things that just kind of get there and connect it together. Remember Atlantic Compromise? The Tuskegee Institute with Booker T. Washington, the Du Bois, the Niagara movement, the NAACP. They do sort of overlap in time period, but most of the time Booker T. Washington is ahead of Du Bois and from past. All right, the political machines in the urban areas. And I know in the notes it's kind of, here is some of the broader ideas that you have. They started out as kind of social clubs. Here in Citrus County, we have the Italian American Social Club. I know we have one or two other ones. I know the Italian American one is, I think, over there by Pope John Paul. But there's a couple of different groups, and that's what they kind of started out. But soon they would realize that you could use them for political means. Political machines a lot of times have a negative connotation. They're not all bad. Here's the good things that you have. Immigrants come off the boat. They help them out, help them find a job, find a place to live. So they're just really nice people, right? They wanted to make sure that they got to voting, and it's good that they got them involved in the political process. The only problem that you have at that time is we didn't have secret ballots. So if you gave someone a job and you wanted them to vote for a certain person, could you make sure that they do? And we'll find this, I mean, even in an election where the most famous election of this time, the 1896 election, that you will have the ballot boxes, and you might be a worker and you really like William Jennings Bryan and his ideas, but when you went to vote, you either went to this ballot box or that ballot box. Your factory owner said, you vote for McKinley. You want a job? You vote for McKinley. You know Bryan's better for you, but do you want to have your job? So you go vote for McKinley so that you keep your job.
They had separate boxes.
Yes, it was not a secret ballot. So you knew exactly who they were writing for. So it wasn't, oh yes, I'm going to vote for McKinley in here, and then you go and you actually vote for Bryan. There wasn't anything like that. Remember that Ocala platform? That was actually one of the things that the populists were fighting for. There that we would get secret ballots, and later on in the progressive era we would. The bad thing is corruption, and you see graft. Graft is a common thing, is a way of corruption. Graft is when you basically find a way to make money on this, and this is where along the way the political machines seem to make money everywhere. Those of you that think everything happens for money, well, this is where the political machines, you can really look at things and say that it does with them. The most famous of all the political machines is Tammany Hall. Who's the leader of it?
Tweed.
Yeah, Tweed, Boss Tweed, or William Tweed. Starts before the Civil War, and what he ends up doing is just playing these different immigrant groups against each other. And he'll make sure that, okay, make sure you vote for this person in your area, your ward, as they call it, and we'd have ward bosses. And then, so the Irish would vote for this group, the Italians for this group, the Czechs for this group, and he would make sure, and he balanced it out, he would make sure that they get certain jobs in it. All along the way, he's making money. William Tweed was never elected to an office himself, but he was the most powerful man in New York City for probably 25 years. That's not the only ones, and here's where we get to kind of to the boring side of it. And this is where, for some of you might be glad, I'm going to try to keep this down as simple as possible. When you see stalwarts and half-breeds, you think Republicans. Those are political machines for Republicans. I am not going to go in depth on what the Stalwarts believed and what the half-breeds believed, because I don't even know half of that, and I really don't want to study it myself. If you're really interested in that, okay, then, all right, you really are liking pain for yourself. Okay, it's not that exciting. But to keep this real simple, the Stalwarts and half-breeds, when you see that, what political party? Say it, just try it again. Stalwarts and half-breeds, what political party? Okay, Republicans. The Stalwarts, Roscoe Conkling was the leader of them. Thomas Nast, remember him? Political cartoons. Ultimately, when people had written editorials and everything about how bad William Tweed was, it was his cartoons that ends up taking down it. You see this picture of Boss Tweed, and you kind of notice with Thomas Nast, you can tell who Boss Tweed is here. And even with this one, and actually for AP exams on a DBQ, they have put this picture on different ones. And a lot of times they will use Thomas Nast as one of your documents on a DBQ for the AP exam. And usually it's involving with political machines. Here are some other Boss Tweed's cartoons, and most of these are Thomas Nast. And you see it here, it just says democracy, but that you have, this was one of the famous one you look with when he's going to jail. This is where the story comes that actually when he escaped to Spain, that supposedly, there's actually a lot of things to say that that story isn't true, but the people in Spain thought that he was a person that kidnapped children. But he was actually captured in Spain not because of that. That just makes a better story. But when he got off a boat, a person in the customs that was an American recognized him and alerted the authorities that here's where Boss Tweed is. But it makes for a better story that the Spanish citizens saw him. They did know this cartoon, but that's actually not how he was alerted. Now maybe in a smaller town or something, that's how they found him. But those are all different Boss Tweed cartoons that you would have. Now the way that you would end up getting the way that political machines have it is what's patronage. A civil day is you're given a job to your friend or someone that's loyal. I see that Trace is going and voting for the right person. If Trace is a common worker, I make sure he keeps his job or gets a job. If he is a business owner and he's got the people in his business voting for him. And see, for some of you, you might work for Trace's business. You guys in here, for a month before the election, don't shave. Because in the morning, you go and vote, and then we'll take you to the barber shop, give you a good haircut and a shave, and then you get to go vote again, because you're now a different person. Okay? Vote once, vote twice. Heck, if you can go to other places, we'll get you voting others. All right, Trace is giving you a day off of work, he's giving you a haircut, he's giving you a shave, and we'll take you to different precincts and get you voting. And if he does that, the ward boss is going to award him the next time they have a contract for whatever his business is, we'll get him the contract.
Nobody did anything about it?
So,
wouldn't people notice since there was like a certain number of people?
And then the problem that you have is, while if Trace is a Democrat and he's doing this for Tammany Hall, Connor over there, Connor is working for the Stalwart Party and Roscoe Conkling. Okay, instead of it being Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall, Roscoe Conkling and the Stalwart. And he's doing the same thing with the Republicans. And this is where we kind of get to things, that this corruption with this political machine kept getting worse and worse and worse. And what would it have, and remember the spoil system. Remember that back with Jackson. Okay, this is what, over time, it keeps getting worse and worse and worse with the spoil system. So something has to be done. Okay, we have graft. That we have in the Grant administration. There was a whole lot of the different scandals that he had. The Credit Mobilier scandal, where they're getting kickbacks from the railroads. The Indian Ring, where they're supposed to be giving money to the Indians, but you know, if the money doesn't actually get to the reservations, don't worry about it. The Whiskey Ring, when they were supposed to take taxes for it. What the Whiskey Ring was simply, if let's say that Haley was a person that's making whiskey and she's supposed to pay a 20% tax, so if she technically should be paying this year $10,000 in tax, but if I write the papers up a little bit different, you're supposed to pay $10,000, but I write it up where you actually pay $2,500 and you give me $2,500. So I make $2,500 and you actually make $5,000 because you don't have to pay it in tax. And that's what was happening in the Whiskey Ring. Which, hey, no one's hurt except for, what about the taxpayers?
But I would only pay tax. I would
You
pay tax.
would still pay tax, but you only pay. You would end up, instead of paying 10,000, you're going to pay 5,000. Of course, half of that 5,000 is going to true tax. The other half's going to me.
Because they thought I'd increase that much or something like that.
I wrote it up a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, you're happy. I'm happy. Everybody's happy, unless of course you're a taxpayer, because we just made it where you have to pay other type of taxes.
Why was Grant considered like such a hero if he had so
Well, he was a hero for the war, as a president. Now, the one thing, and this is where when we start watching it, the one great thing that Grant did do is he did do a lot of things to stop the KKK. And where the KKK surged to power for a short period of time, he almost crushed them, and quickly did. If it was something for military. And you see political cartoons again. All right, whiskey ring, you have this. I mean, here this is supposed to be Grant, and these are different rings that you have. You can't see the labels, but one of them is like the Navy ring. Garfield gets assassinated, our 20th president. And that would lead to the Pendleton Act. Here is your major SFI for this section. When you see things for political machines, patronage is a word you need to know, but the Pendleton Act, and this is one of the biggest laws in American history. It reformed the civil service system. No longer was your job in the government by who you voted for. It now went by with what is your experience? What is your education? If you want to know how much I make as a teacher, you can go look it up. Okay, because you're paid for as a teacher by however your number of years is, what your education is, and the Citrus County schools have it listed there. This is why for some things that are wanting to do education reform, to look at things. If I'm a good teacher or a bad teacher, I'm getting paid the same. And that's where some people have said we need to change that system. There. So this is where the Pendleton Act though made it that way, where it's no longer doing anything for favoritism that way. It was straight out. What was your performance? And what is called the merit system. They use the merit system, which is, are you doing better with things? If you're hired by the post office, you don't get promoted just because you're somebody's cousin. You have to show that you are performing at a certain level. Unfortunately, sometimes you have it where you might have someone a lot better, but they haven't served as many years. I've been teaching for over 15 years. Could there be a first-year teacher that's a better teacher than me? Easily. But I'm going to get paid more. Why? Because I've been here longer. Okay? Could there be a teacher that's been teaching longer than me that is worse than me, that I'm getting paid less? Yeah. And that's where some of the things with the civil service. But does it matter whether or not if, with Miss Himmel, what my relationship is with Miss Himmel, our superintendent of schools, does it matter with her what my pay is? No. Whether I supported her in the election or didn't support her, that doesn't matter. And that's what the Pendleton Act tried to do, is take out the politics. And it did some things to it. All right, Stalwarts and half-breeds are what party?
Republican.
Okay, Republican. In the election, now the Stalwarts were led by Conkling, kind of remember with him, who was known for a lot for his corruption. And this is where I know I go on Boss Tweed. Conkling is the likeness of Boss Tweed for the Republicans, just not quite as bad, but nearly. Meanwhile, the half-breeds, there was a guy by the name of James Blaine, who would actually be running for president in one of the elections of this time period. They wanted reforms, but Blaine was actually corrupt. The Republicans in 1880, the Stalwarts wanted Chester Arthur, the half-breeds wanted Garfield. So the Republicans, so not to split up, they joined together and did a compromise. Garfield would be president, Arthur would be vice president. After Garfield was elected, we would have Charles Gatu, I'm not sure if I pronounced that name right, but he would go and assassinate a Republican. He's a Republican, but he's shooting a Republican. And after he shot him, and you don't have to know Charles Gatu or something his name, you don't know. But after he shot him, he said, I'm a Stalwart and Arthur is president now. So we have the groups of Republicans that are fighting so much. You kind of look at it today, we don't have the Republicans so much fighting against itself, but we do have some rifts in the Republican Party with the Tea Party and the moderates. So can you imagine someone as Tea Party that said, oh, Romney was too moderate. Well, let me shoot him. All right, he won the presidency, let's shoot him so that Paul Ryan could become president if they would have won the election. Okay, but that's what was happening at that time. It showed how bad things were. We had people shooting people of their own party. Do you think there's a little bit of problems in our political system at that time, these political machines? And what would happen is we would have that civil service reform. The Pendleton Act would be passed after this time. Garfield was actually trying before. The third group, still Republicans. But by the time we get to 1884, there are some Republicans that are saying, if we have any honest person or someone we think is honest, we'll vote for them, even if they're Democrats. And those are the Mugwumps. So Stalwarts, half-breeds, and Mugwumps are all what party? Republican. And if you remember anything, just remember that. Okay, and then so the Mugwumps are the ones, and that's how Grover Cleveland gets into office, our one Democrat kind of popping up in this time period. He's actually helped to office by Republicans. And here's in 1884. Notice the strength of the Democratic Party, but the key difference is, where does New York go? New York was today's Ohio and Florida, okay? Which basically, in Ohio was actually the state also. Usually if you won New York and Ohio, you won the election at that time. So realistically, New York took the place of Florida in today's current elections. Ohio still always has been probably the bellwether. And you think about it, the Midwest, okay? It's kind of people living in Ohio, you have some cities like Cincinnati, Cleveland, but you also have some rural areas. So it's a microcosm of the United States. And it's not like out west where you have some western states that are all rural. It's not like some of the eastern states where it's more urban. It is a mix of it. All right, the farmers' issues, and here's where the money issue comes in. This is where, again, we kind of have a quick review of some of the part. The greenback part. What is a greenback?
They want to put money.
Yeah, they want paper money. Why do they want paper money?
To reduce that.
Well, to reduce debt, because inflation would do that. What is bimetallism? Yeah, gold and silver. Most people weren't going to go straight out with straight paper money. They want it backed by something in here. And you see, I mean, here's the cartoon with silver. President Cleveland establishes the gold standard. Silverman and Panet. If you ever see 16-1, we would have this happen a couple times in history. In the 1830s, we would have this passed, and now that we would have this in the late 1800s. And what it did is that by law, it made it where 16 ounces of silver equaled 1 ounce of gold. So if you ever see, and this is a popular, that was a campaign slogan even at that time, 16-1. And that is what William James Bryan was pushing for. And what the gold bugs, the people that weren't wanting that, were wanting more for just straight up on gold. But William James Bryan, and when he gave his Cross of Gold speech, and I promise you sometime I'll play a little bit, it's not that exciting, but this is where he'd have this, and when he was giving that speech, and it was kind of dramatic about how you're crucifying the common man on a cross of gold. And so you can get that visual image of it there. So farmers, if you were in school up to about 30, 40 years ago, if you were in the South or the Midwest, you would have had to, probably in 8th grade, memorize part of the Cross of Gold speech. If you were in any type of rural community, because this is where William James Bryan was fighting for the common person, not for the richman. And this is where the term populist party comes in, was popular. Obama was a populist candidate. He was trying to go for the masses and fight for them. And so many things in politics today are actually like this time period. We did not have we don't have today quite as dramatic of the change. Where we had a little bit over a year ago, and the big thing was about the 99% and the 1%. Our 1% at this time period, when we get to 1896, 3 men were the 1%. If you put the value of Rockefeller, Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan together, They were over 1% of the value of America. So 3 men controlled that wealth. Today we have that as like 400 something people. But those 3 men, were they a little rich?
Yeah.
So it's, but that's where, and any guess of how you think that Carnegie, Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan felt about William James Bryan? Oh, they didn't like him. And the one time in history where they normally were like rivals with each other, the one time they came together, and this is where the guy Marcus Hanna comes in, they all supported to make sure that William McKinley won this election. Okay? And realistically, even though they didn't have super PACs, they were a super PAC at that time, making sure money went, all right, to get William McKinley elected against Bryan. They were scared half to death of William James Bryan. And he went right after him, because that's it. Do people sometimes today in politics use going after rich, all right, and pointing them out? So that's where they were months ago. All right, Interstate Commerce Act. Interstate means what? It was yesterday. 2 or more. What's commerce?
Trade.
The Interstate Commerce Act gave it where the federal government is in charge of this. So more government. Comes about because of the Granger cases. This was also in the section that we had on the farmers, but here's your cases to be familiar. Wabash versus Illinois says the states couldn't control it, but the Interstate Commerce Act gave it to the federal government. Alexander Hamilton smiling from ear to ear as almost 100 years later, Congress is doing what he said should be done in his report on manufacturers. And Munn versus Illinois backs it up. And it says that the government can come in on something that is essential to a person's life. And a government can regulate businesses. All right, economic downturns. The 2 that you have to know from this period, they're 20 years apart, 1873, 1893. What's the biggest industry post-Civil War? Railroads. Guess what happens when bad things happen to the railroads?
Bad things have to become.
Yeah. And then the railroads are connected with the banks. Both times, railroads and banks. That's what causes it. I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but I am oversimplifying it for us. I know all of you want to go really in depth of why these things happen. Okay? But when in doubt, when you have anything for an economic problem, it is a banking problem. There's usually something else that caused that banking problem. At this time period, it is the railroads. Until the Great Depression would happen, the 1893 was the worst. Even though we call it a panic, we could call it a recession. There you see it was 5 years long. Coxey's Army. Here's one, and this is something that is interesting to me, and it's kind of a whole bunch of unemployed people got tired of being unemployed. They went to Washington, D.C. and said, do something about it. Make jobs. What was the philosophy of government at that time, though?
Stay out of it.
Yeah, you stay out of it. Government doesn't make jobs. Now, that would change in the Great Depression, because when things got so bad, Franklin Roosevelt would create jobs, and we get to the New Deal program. Today, at our last recession, we had the stimulus package, which the idea was to make jobs. Reason why? Highway 44 is getting paved right now. Most of that money is coming from the stimulus package. It was going to have to be done sometime soon, but, well, we got a lot of people that were unemployed. This road's going to have to be repaved soon, so the federal government helps to pay and get that highway repaved. There, and to have people working. If the economy gets going, then those workers will hopefully be working on other construction projects that aren't being paid for the government, is the idea of it. But that's where Coxey's Army has that part. All right, monopolies. I'm going to, again, keep this real simple. When you see antitrust, replace the word trust with monopoly. Okay, whenever you see antitrust, a trust is a monopoly. So what was the Sherman Antitrust Act against? Right, monopolies. And this is where, when I go back to the other section, you're going to see how did Rockefeller, Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan get so rich? It was monopolies. But Congress would pass it on. The Sherman Antitrust Act was a great bill with no punishment. If you have all kinds of laws, if you have laws saying you can't speed, but if you speed, nothing's going to happen to you, do you really care? All right, why is the reason why most of you, when you're speeding, you slow down?
There's some cops come by.
They give you a ticket and you got to pay. And it's not cheap.
And your insurance.
Well, your insurance would be a side effect. So, but if there was just speeding laws and they're just suggestions, would you even worry about it?
No.
All right, tariff issue. Don't worry, tariffs will come up in here. But the McKinley tariff, it was one that people didn't like it, and realistically, it was almost like Obamacare, but in the 1880s. Because when the Republicans passed this in 1890, a midterm election, the Democrats ended up taking over the House and the Senate because there was such a backlash on this tariff. The other thing that ended up happening, and we're going to get to this later on, the tax system. The tax system was still based upon farmers. And if you are a farmer, it was unfair to you because you're getting taxed a lot more of what the value is. Even if you have a bad year, you're going to have to pay taxes. Meanwhile, someone living in the city, the way the system was there, they might make millions of dollars and really not have to pay any taxes. Meanwhile, you're a farmer and you had half your cows die that year of disease, but you still got to pay taxes. And so this is where the populists were a group that were fighting for that. And these are kind of things that we would kind of be leading to. All right, muckrakers. What are muckrakers?
Right.
Yeah, they're right. They're not really propaganda, though. And they would sensationalize some things, the yellow journal, but not totally. They're kind of exposing things that are wrong. Now, would they maybe exaggerate some to tell their story? It'd be kind of like today we have our investigative journalism, and they want to tell about roaches at Checkers. All right, are they going to amp it up a little bit so you're going to watch it? Okay, and that's kind of what they did. And this is actually another one leading into our next section. Henry George, he's not one, and we haven't had him on our people. When you hear about the haves and the have-nots, he's the one that wrote about this. If you were to replace have and have-nots, it would be the rich and the not-so-rich, or the poor. The haves are the robber barons, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, those groups. Meanwhile, the have-nots are all the common people. And what he did is blamed everything on the rich. Jacob Riis, one from our People reports, wrote how the other half lives, but actually was even more effective, photographs. And when he started going around to some of the richer and middle class people, which we totally didn't know what was going on with some of the richer people, it would then showed what was happening to some of them. Edward Bellamy. If I was a good AP teacher, Mr. Black, I had to read this in my AP class in there. And it tells about how realistically what the United States should do is have the United States government take over the industries. Which, not too long before that, we had this guy by the name of Karl Marx that he and Engels had written the Communist Manifesto, which kind of said the same idea. But here we have an American kind of writing and saying, why is it that Carnegie is making so much money with the steel industry? Why is Rockefeller making so much money with the oil industry? So looking backward, and it actually is a book that is one that a lot of times for AP. If you want to, over Thanksgiving week, you can go and read that on your own. Haley, you wanted an assignment? There you have one. Okay. All right, this is kind of even though some of this might, we're going to kind of look and see real quick through the presidents. Kind of listening through, I said these aren't very good presidents, but what you kind of do is, and for some of you, here's something to grab a hold of. And this is like in your writing. One reason why I have the president's quizzes is, it's not that I'm going to come and find you and say, Taylor, who's the 20th president, if I see you a few years from now. The thing is when it comes to writing, sometimes for those of you, and you're thinking, all right, this time period, what is there? And you can get something concrete. Now with these presidents, Andrew Johnson, what big thing was happening during Johnson's presidency?
Reconstruction.
Okay, Reconstruction. And for SFIs with that Tenure of Office Act, remember they tried to impeach him? And I called it the Radical Reconstruction because they didn't like his idea. What about Grant?
Scandals, spread of violence.
And there's where scandals, and during the end of his presidency, actually the second term, we would have a panic. If you're president, Do you get blamed for an economic downturn?
Yes.
Is it the president's fault?
No.
No, it's not. Okay, I mean, this is where whether things go up or down. If the economy takes off in the next couple of years, is that because of Obama?
Yes.
Okay, which you take credit for that. I mean, Bill Clinton did, so did Ronald Reagan. It doesn't matter what party. Sometimes it's a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Martin Van Buren, George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, they happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Right after they took office, the economy takes a downturn. Or for Bush, it happened 2 years into it. And it got blamed on them. When we look back, we said, oh, actually, they weren't that bad of guys. But at that time period, you got to blame it on them. All right, Rutherford v. Hayes.
Compromise of 1877.
Okay, the Compromise of 1877. And anyone know who Lemonade Lucy is? This is wife, the First Lady. Anyone know why she was named Lemonade Lucy?
She gave lemonade and all the guy.
Right. Why did she serve lemonade at the White House? No alcohol. And some people did not like that, especially when the president before it was Grant, who was known for alcohol to flow pretty freely. And here this lady is not serving any. All right, Garfield. Oh, there's Lemonade Lucy. Yeah, he's assassinated, which leads to this civil service reform. The Pendleton Act, who Arthur would be the one pushing it through, but it would basically pass because of Garfield getting assassinated. All right, these 4 presidents so far, nothing really great with them, right? I mean, we're having things happen, but nothing great. Chester Arthur. Now here's a stylish guy. Anyone tell me anything good for Chester Arthur?
Here's bow tie.
He actually was a very good president. So it's amazing when things we look at it. The Pendleton Act was passed with him, so that's one thing you have. And one thing that he did is we still had the same Navy that we had from the Civil War. So it is 25 years old. And he pushed to modernize it, which, when you modernize a Navy, it doesn't occur overnight. It takes basically about 10 years before you get rid of the older ships and replace them with newer ships. And so by the time we get to where he's pushing for this, you see 1885 and 1895, we have a newer Navy, which of course we've got to use that when we're going to go and fight the Spanish-American War and go into the next century. Grover Cleveland, the trivia-wise, the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. He's our 22nd and our 24th president.
Mr. Best, it looks like Mr. McLeod. In the right picture.
Yeah, we'll have to
The Married Brothers.
find out.
Great grandfather.
And with him, this is where, during his presidency, now he was pretty unlucky because the second term is when the Panic of 1893 started. He actually, I mean, this is where it's kind of an interesting story. He had cancer of the jaw, but things were so bad in 1893 that, and he was doing some things trying to get some economic reforms done, that he had the operation, they did it out on a boat in New York Harbor to keep it secret so that nobody would know what's going on. When they basically took out his jawbone and replaced it with, it was like a piece of hard rubber or something like that.
Ew.
But that's where he had cancer. But the Mugwumps are the other things with him. All right, Benjamin Harrison. Got him in between the 2 elections of Cleveland. Splits up in his term, but this is when we would have the Sherman Antitrust Act and the McKinley Tariff passed during his time. And William McKinley, the last of our, again, he's probably the strongest of these. Spanish-American War would happen, which will be in our next section when we get to imperialism. One of the biggest things that would happen was they would choose as his vice president Teddy Roosevelt, and we would then finally get to a powerful president there. And Teddy Roosevelt would get that because McKinley would be assassinated right after his re-election. And who did McKinley beat in both elections? Anyone know?
William James.
Yeah, William James Bryan. All right. William James Bryan, again, he's the Henry Clay of that time period. All right, 1896, he tries to go the populist way. 1900, he's going to try to go anti-imperialism. but he loses both time to McKinley. Impact of the Gilded Age politics, the biggest thing, where I started out with the political machines, the corruption and everything, we'd have the changes. Our next time period, the progressive era, would come before that. We would have taxes, the tariffs, that would be reformed. The Sherman Antitrust Act, even though it was written good but had no provisions, later on we would fix it with what would be called the Clayton Antitrust Act. There. The People or Populist Party, even though William J. Bryan would lose, the Republicans and Democrats would adopt their ideas, and then in the early 1900s they would go with it. And we are finally done with the